now it's open forum. I don't know if my speakers haven't necessarily prepared anything. I'm not sure if they have. They'd like to say something. But my three speakers are Grant from the Office of National Statistics, Paul from the RSS, and Vicky Price from Better Statistics. You okay, Vicky? Because I know you're not feeling that well. Are you sure you're all right?
In what way?
You taught me.
The fact that I hadn't slept because of...
Well, you can still carry on. Okay. I'll leave. One there. Good. I'd like to just say a few words to introduce this session because this, by all means, please come. It's a very seminal. This whole aspect of prices was very seminal in the actual creation of Better Statistics. I'd just like you to tell you briefly the story, because myself and my colleagues, all of whom come from the commercial environment, one of my colleagues actually hasn't made it at all, he broke his arms, I think, but we were concerned about the economic statistics and particularly the relationship of the British economy, and we didn't think that small business and the new gig was being effectively measured properly within the GDP. And we formed a campaign for better business statistics. And then along came, guess what, COVID, which made us all sort of lie back at home and wonder about things. And I was just reading up, and the Office of National Statistics asked for comments on one of their consultations, which was about the CPIH and the RPI, and should the CPIH replace the RPI? And I read all that on this, and I was very interested, and as far as I could tell, though there was a lot of statement that the RPI was no good, I couldn't find the evidence to support me. I'm sorry, I'm a mathematician as well as a statistician, and I thought, well, I don't really understand this. And my colleagues sort of talked about it, and we put in our own little ideas. And then it was announced at the end of that year that, yes, it was being replaced and it was going to be done in 2030, precisely. The CPIH would become the RPI. And as it was characterised by somebody at the RSS, this is like taking an old car and calling it a Rolls Royce without something and not. And so that was from the RSS, that comment. Now, what I subsequently discovered was that we had, and most of 837 other people who'd actually replied to the consultation, had misread what the consultation was about because of the nature of the title had misled it. It was not considering whether or not the CPIH would replace the RPI. The consultation was when would it do it. Now, it was interesting that you had to read the small print and not the top to understand that. So I've had a sort of conspiracy theory about this myself ever since. And I've observed one or two other. Now, there's, in my view, going back to, there's no question of conspiracy, but there is a question of senior people in important places not necessarily paying enough attention to precisely what is going on. Now, there's one thing that I think you'll find a theme from the users, which is, for heaven's sake, try to keep it simple. Something not raised today at all, but I do raise it, is the question of scraping. How exactly is this method, this new method of scraping, getting information, going to measure our inflation rate? It's a mathematical, it's going to be confusing. I don't know how it's going to work. The examples I have seen of the tests that have been done are completely jejune, in my view, and there are people playing around with concepts for little importance. So let's say something specific about inflation, that today it's different from what it was yesterday, for almost all of us. It's an approximate figure which is used for a purpose. That is actually what statistics is about. That's why they say there are so many lies or downloads. There aren't really. They're just well-defined concepts, which are approximations which we use for particular purposes. They are never actually precise. Nobody knows what the population of this country is at this moment. We use a figure for that purpose, which we collectively agree that's a reasonable estimate. Oddly enough, If you go to a famous international website, was it the International Monetary Fund, you'll find a different measure of our population than you will on the Office of National Statistics. I haven't actually investigated why this is, but there are two different estimates, and they're substantially different. You'll also actually find two different estimates within what the ONS itself publicises, but I won't go into that detail. They should be very consistent in using one figure, please, at least. So that's the background, the better statistics view of this matter, and we consider it to be probably the most important statistic, national statistic, because it's one that everybody has their own experience of, it's the one that everybody affects everybody, and it should be understandable and believable and acceptable. And that's the background as far as I'm to our talk. And now, discussing the question of governance, which has been raised, I am very interested by, and I'd like the comments on, these two committees, which is unique, the technical and the what's called the stakeholder committee. And I'm particularly interested, why are they independent? Should not the technical committee actually report to the stakeholder committee? Should not the stakeholder committee be allowed to ask questions and get feedback? I'd like to understand that structure. Okay?
Sorry, was that a question?
I think I've said enough.
Well, look, I wasn't around, certainly wasn't in the UK, I think, at the time the RPI Advisory Council or Committee or whatever it was called existed. But in the 5.5 years I've been at the Office for National Assistance, I think the two advisory panels on consumer prices seem to work quite well. I think one of the reasons we have two rather than one, and it's a good question, Tony, is just a practical one, which is finding academics and practitioners whose life's obsession seems to be index number theory. A small group, a very technical group, who come along because they're genuinely interested in this and they think the ONS is doing interesting work in this field. For example, how we incorporate scanner data into our headline numbers. That's quite a different group than the people that we have on the stakeholder panel, which we try to represent the range of opinions out there. I take the point that you could potentially broaden that out further, and there's maybe a case of clarifying who is on there basically ex officio versus who is there because of their expertise, but that's certainly something we can look at. I don't think combining the two would necessarily work any more effectively than the current approach, and I think that the two committees, thanks in part to the very able chairing of Dame Kate Barker, work well together. But always happy to look at how we can improve that system. I think it's also interesting to note that other major areas of statistics, so you think about, for example, our suite of labour market statistics or our national accounts, don't have an equivalent national advisory stakeholder panel. And one of the things we're looking at the moment is whether we ought to be creating something similar to this model for the national accounts and labour market areas. Because clearly there are other areas where there's a lot going on. It would be really useful to have that input from stakeholders in terms of what we should be doing. So that is under active consideration at the moment. So I think I'll just leave it there, but certainly we're always open for suggestions. And of course we have people such as Jill on the committee who I don't think are backward about coming forward when they have views to put forward.
But yes, well, I would say, I can vouch for when Grant Fissner came over, since I was instrumental in bringing him over from Australia. I remember interviewing him on Zoom or on video with Sydney Harbour behind him. And so we had to lure him away from that wonderful place. And he did come, and I'm very pleased about that. But I think there is an issue about statistics more generally and how much we know. So you mentioned, Tony, so I can move away from the inflation data for a second. We don't know how many people are here. How long did we go before we realized that all of us were trying to understand what's going to happen to population, therefore what's going to happen to housing? Because you mentioned Kate Barker, and she now chairs a housing commission that I've been instrumental in setting up for one of the think tanks I'm involved with. And of course, the population forecast given to councils were completely underestimating what was happening in the UK. So we have these problems time and time again. Is it a question of governance? And of course, we still didn't know how many people we didn't know how many people were here because we never counted the people who left the UK. And it's only more recently that we have a bit more of an idea of this. So for example, the immigration data came out today as well. And great stuff about how the numbers have gone down of net migration. But of course, the reason that they have gone down, and it was counted by the ONS or whoever it was doing it for you, is because, lots of people have left and we didn't even know who they were, where they've gone. But we do know, for example, that from the Euro side, it's now negative in terms of people coming in and going. So there's a lot that isn't there to be able to say anything positive, anything sensible about the economy and where it's going. So you talked about economics. This has always been our problem, that we have relied on a lot of the statistics coming to us in order to guess what was happening in the economy. And I do remember when Grant, I think, was still there at BIS when we were working there, that one of the statistics which was absolutely useless was the construction statistic, which for some reason my department and me as the chief economist there were responsible for. We had statisticians doing it. Nobody would fill in the survey. And if they did, they didn't fill it right. And so we had to re-estimate this again. And it really caused huge changes to GDP. So how can you as a government now, for example, how can they claim we got out of recession if, in a month's time, all the statistics were revised downwards, which was usually what used to happen. And why do we need to have monthly data as well? That's a bit crazy. Why can't we do something different and ignore that and just have our quarterly one, which is actually pretty unreliable anyway, but the monthly data is quite unreliable. It's got a bit better, I think. But of course, we saw with COVID, nobody was filling in the forms anyway and the surveys, and there is a serious problem about and maybe some countries have obligatory filling in of surveys. So for the economists to be able then to use statistics properly and say something sensible to government, or even to decide something on the outside in terms of what's happening, shall we then therefore invest or not invest, there are huge gaps. Now, before I sort of pull my hair out and say how terrible it was, I do remember I've been a European economist as well, and some of the data in Europe, traditionally, until sort of more recently when the Eurostat has sort of worked a little bit harder to make sure there's a lot of harmonized stuff around, we just didn't have it. Trying to say what was going to be happening to Italy or Belgium. Belgium was the worst offender. I think we wouldn't get the GDP data or any other data for a good 6 months. Of course, it didn't have a government for a while, and probably didn't have it. Statistics people were just going off to wherever it is that they were going off to, drink Belgian beer instead. But it is a problem. If you can't rely on the statistics, how can you have proper economic policy? It's with difficulty.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Tony, for inviting me here. As a person kind of billed as representing the RSS, I feel a bit reluctant to say the next bit, but I'm going to say it anyway. I love that quote that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. In fact, all statistics are wrong, but some statistics are useful. And I think what we're trying to get at here is almost like a two cultures, or two nations, or two, C.P. Snow was two cultures, wasn't it? Methodology and fitness for purpose. And I've heard so much this afternoon about kind of the importance of having good methodology and the rightness and what does right mean. I'm going to pick up some words from the title from the title of the event, Tony. Are we using the right answers? Well, there's no such thing as right really in this context, but it's got to be kind of good enough for purpose. So we've got to understand what the purposes are, and yet, as we heard from Ed at the beginning, and it's been repeated many times, there are multiple purposes here. Your title was in the plural. Are we using the right measures? Unfortunately, a few minutes ago, you said it all the time. Inflation is it. Well, is inflation it, or are there different aspects of inflation, different dimensions of inflation, different experiences of inflation? And I think to try and kind of work through this, I kind of rationalise it as thinking about kind of the supply of and the demand for inflation measures. Blah, blah. And we're very strong on the supply of, and we spend a lot of time looking at the processes and the methodology. I still don't think we spend enough time thinking on, well, let's grow the demand for understanding these measures. Now, belatedly, and I take a lot of what Simon was saying about the RSS, but one thing we are trying to do now is to kind of think about supporting public understanding and engagement with the statistics and the issues of the day. And how can we do that? I haven't heard actually a lot about that this afternoon, so maybe that's one thing we can talk about. Rather than kind of looking at the governance, how is the governance going to help with that understanding and engagement? I scribbled lots of kind of notes during the afternoon, an interesting thing to say, but I think I'll stop there since you're hovering.
Well, I just realised how darn late it is. I'm very sorry. Come on, let's have some questions, please. Jeff, yes.
It's the point Vicky makes about the data, and there's a lot of data uncertainty at the moment with the electoral survey. But I do, amongst others, but I do wonder about this sort of a relationship between statistical uncertainty and economic uncertainty. We had the Bernanke review recently, which at one level seems to have been regarded as a missed opportunity. But at another level, he was saying that the Bank of England doesn't really have a model of how the economy works. I don't think that's the fault of the statisticians in that case. I don't think that absence of that model is a function of inadequate statistics. It's a function of inadequate understanding of the economy. A good example of that, when the global financial crisis happened, there's talk about statisticians missing the timing and things like that, but I don't think it was really about the timing. I don't really think it was about the data. It was about underlying mechanisms that weren't properly understood. So I think that's an important interplay, and it comes back to this sort of dialogue between the economists and the statisticians. And it's easy to bash. It's easy to bash the statisticians. I don't know if I've been doing it myself. I think I've been trying to bash the economists. But yeah, sorry, that's just a general point.
Could I say,
That's the two sides.
I wasn't at all actually the statisticians. I was just saying that the government decides not to collect various things. It's whatever the borders agency was doing. It's the money that wasn't used for it. When we were trying to understand what was happening in the region, so this whole levelling up thing, but actually we haven't got a clue what's going on because we don't have the data, and we don't have the data not because of all the statisticians, because we haven't invested in it. At least we hadn't invested for some time. You probably, I don't know how many of you remember the Allsop review. Yeah, you were on it. You remember? I think I was there, probably sponsoring it, whatever. And so Chris also did this review. We understood we needed all these regional statistics, and it was absolutely great. And we were going to fund it and so on. And what happened? Patricia Hewitt at the last minute, who was my Secretary of State, decided to give it to. I'm sorry about this, Jeff. You must remember it. To a trade unions training fund. It just went for whatever reason. Maybe it was near an election, or whatever it was. Maybe it was 2005 or something like that. And that money just disappeared, just like that, because trade unions wanted it. So we never got the also regional statistics review, which was going to then lead to all the stuff we're going to be getting. Just didn't happen at all. It was all abandoned. You probably remember that. So there are things. It's politics, I think. You're not blaming the statisticians for any of this. It's just that the money isn't available, or the governance perhaps isn't there, or whatever it is that doesn't lead to the desired outcomes.
Well, if I continue my own story, I mentioned 827 responses to that consultation, and I've not read them all, but everyone I've read has said, don't think this is a good idea. Now, a number of them were write-ins on behalf of, I'm a member of this pension fund, so I don't agree with it, and so on and so on. But there were a number of others, including a very erudite paper on the mathematics saying nothing wrong with the RPI. Why on earth don't we carry on with it? Which unfortunately because they have some rules. I don't know actually who wrote this paper. It's a very, very good paper. But the point is that within a year of that, within a few months actually, in 2021, it happened to be corresponding with Professor Bean, who wrote the Bean report. And that year was an advisor on the OBR. And the OBR published their thing for the budget. And I, who don't really know very much, do I wrote to Charlie and I said, Charlie Bean, I said, excuse me, you have underestimated inflation. And he wrote back and said, well, we talked about it, we mentioned it. And there's an attitude of mine there which really worries me. Though this, please note, was before Ukraine, which has been blamed, but it was obvious to me as a businessman who's worked in business all his life, although a statistician, that inflation would be an issue as a direct result of the lockdowns and both internationally, that was going to affect trade, and into all the businesses even that had suffered dramatically. How were they going to recover their business position? They were going to have to put up prices in some way, and people were going to have to as well. And although I could never claim to have imagined what was subsequently going to happen, the point is it was obvious to me, and I am puzzled about the groupthink that sort of goes on, that it is definitely there, that people don't seem to be able to look outside the box enough to say, well, hang on, something which to me was obvious. Now, I obviously work, no, we don't work together, but I'm pleased to say I know Simon very well now, and I hope I'll slightly disagree with him. That I myself was not entirely pleased with what's happened with the Livesey report, but it is a chance for change, and I'm very delighted that you are here and that Grant and that Ed came as well, because I hope you will think that there really is something not quite right in the engagement process now, and I hope that the RSS will, actually I believe the RSS is taking more interest in the matter. I'm fond of saying about better statistics, people say, why does it exist? And I have no idea why it exists, but one of the reasons it exists because actually the RSS was not doing a good enough job a couple of years ago, but I think it's getting better. And it's important that it does, and I shall be very pleased to stop better statistics altogether and give way to properly the RSS and to others. But better statistics exists because there is a problem, and it's wider than inflation, as we've heard, and it does need better methodology. It does need more concern. I'm delighted that somebody from DWS, from the Government Statistical Service, is here. Thank you very much for coming on. They do a very good job, you know. We hear a lot about the ONS, but the Government Statistical Service we don't actually see a lot of. Interesting, I attended a conference and there were 76 people, 1/3 of all attendees were from the ONS. There was nobody from the Government Statistical Service there at the conference, which I thought was amazing. Budgets, sorry. I think we have to go. I know. Sorry, a close question, yeah.
Just a quick question really for you, Grant. As someone with nature in general, you mentioned very briefly looking into user engagement on the national accounts. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about that? How is that being set up? And well, I suppose from our perspective is that, you know, when you do research, how do you go about doing this? Do you do like a big review of literature on engagement and then, you know, filter it out and see what works and sample comparisons?
So I think it's partly just a response to the Livesey review, and also partly the observation that we have a system that, despite some criticisms today, I think works quite well on the prices side, and we don't have that on the national accounts or the labour market side. And I think, you know, I think the Livesey review was very clear about the need for greater user consultation and user input, and that's now advisory committees are not the only way you do that. You also need to go out and engage with the wider public, hold public consultations as appropriate, make sure that communications are clear and accessible, etc. But it's one way of bringing those voices to the table, if you like. So we're looking at that. I don't have a proposal I can share with you today, but like I said, it's under active consideration, which is civil service speak for saying we're probably going to do this reasonably soon, but we haven't firmed up the details.
Can you share it with better statistics
Well, when we're in a position to, yes.
before you sign it off?
Sure.
Ooh, thank you. So, Jeff, yes. Last question.
I don't want to, someone else. I want to come back on to Vicky a bit. I didn't know. I mean, I know that when the audit review was due to be implemented, someone went to the ONS to do it. One of the members of the review team went to the ONS to do it, and the money was pulled. I didn't know that it was pulled by trade unions. I suspect trade unions didn't know that they were pulling this money out of the Allsop review.
Perhaps I shouldn't be saying this, but I mean, it's all being recorded, I have to be careful, but that's standing at the time
Well,
You have-
from my boss.
I understand that unions consider regional activity incredibly important. But I think, the resourcing is in a way the key issue. Really, isn't it? And we keep coming back to it. We've been to it. We've been here before. We had the big statistical modernisation programme, which, given we've been recorded, I should say that was Fujitsu. And I don't think it delivered as hoped. Then we had the Beam review. I know Ed mentioned he was going to talk about the Beam review, but one of the sort of interesting things about the Beam review was that it really expanded what the ONS were doing, lots of new agendas and things like that. And sometimes that's problematic because these agendas become very fashionable, so people's careers can get a boost by going to work on the new agenda rather than working on the core business of the organisation. But it seems hard to look at the challenges facing the organisation and not think some more money isn't needed.
Sorry. Last question.
Really serious thought needs to be given to how it's used, and not set up another thing. It not be this, but to focus it on the core business of the organisation.
Well, I hope if there is a change of government, you can have some influence on making sure that happens.
Francis?
And a comment on regional statistics, just a brief one. So I think I identified this as if you like, an unmet need a couple of years ago and worked with colleagues to help develop the Government Statistical Service subnational statistics strategy, which I think we published about 2 years ago. We set up a new subnational division to produce statistics analysis. We've also now created, with help from funding from Department for Levelling Up, an ONS local service. The level of appetite out there for regional and subnational statistics is huge. So there's still a lot of unmet need out there, but I think we're doing a much better job than we were years ago.
True.
But there's so much more that we could do, I think.
Sorry, Francis, last question.
I was sort of thinking back to CEO O'Donnell's comment about fashions in science, because it strikes me we have fashions in statistics. And that's very much determined by the state of the economy at the time. So at the moment we've got inflation, so we're having seminars on inflation now, but for 15 years inflation was the dog that didn't bark. And central banks trying to get inflation up to target, not worrying about getting it down. And what we were discussing all the time then was GDP, debts and deficits, which are a different category of statistics. You mentioned Irving Fisher, and I put Keynes into that bucket as well. But all the focus of the economists at that time was on employment. We didn't have labour market. Labour market statistics. Okay, so we've got common labour market statistics. Yeah, that's nothing that you've got for employment. We're supposed to we didn't have. We'd be having seminars on, oh my goodness, we need better employment statistics, better unemployment statistics. You can't have a policy this way.
Well,
It seems to me that, if you're going to concentrate about become data-driven, statistics-driven, you can't be swinging from one preferred statistic to another preferred statistic, depending on what your particular policy objective at the time is driven by what you think the state of the economy is. You need, in ways, to abstract from that and have a. I'm not saying, and I'm really complaining about policymakers or these statisticians here, but more to do with where the policy focuses at any one time, particularly where the communication is at any one time. You can, the state of your debt and deficit is your headline news every night, which it was at one stage, and inflation doesn't get mentioned at all. Now you've got inflation as a headline figure, and no mention of debt and deficit.
Well, I'm
That's
sorry.
not strictly speaking true, but debt and deficit is always mentioned. And of course, if you don't have a problem with inflation because you have globalization or we're members of the EU and therefore people can come and go, then obviously you're not going to focus on that particularly. But it's a political issue.
Yeah.
So unemployment is a political issue. It would be. And productivity. But now people talk about productivity. Nobody understands from the outside what we're talking about. But they mention it in the ratio reviews because basically you want growth. Now I say that as productivity is not that important. I was actually responsible for productivity and won the PSA 1 at the time. So for the UK economy, amazingly. But it was an important thing because it allowed growth at the time. And we had to go and explain to the ministers that actually, don't worry too much about productivity for this quarter. You've got full employment and therefore you have quite good growth. So if it's at the expense of productivity for a little while, you can live with that. So politics enters into this and what it is that you should focus on. I don't think it's a fad that suddenly we worry about inflation. But I do think, I'm sorry to have to say, because you mentioned the vernacular and not having a model, the idea that you could learn hugely from going back 70 years when you have a completely different environments now it's
crazy.
And none of the other, I think it was a waste of time, and none of the other, it's been recorded, oh dear, and none of the other central banks was any better.
Yeah.
And and he did say that, Bernanke said that. And the real problem, I think, in this particular case, and I think you've got a point there, Francis, is what it is that you bang on about.
Exactly.
So the problem with banging on about inflation and what you might be doing with interest rates, is confusing everyone completely. And the real danger is that people make decisions on growth, investment, and all that sort of stuff in their own businesses, since it is, after all, the private sector that keeps us going. We can't actually even calculate productivity in the public sector, even though some figures are coming out. Sorry about this, but perhaps you've got it right now. But every time there is a pronouncement like that, people make a decision which could be pretty bad for the economy, even if the figures, as we were saying, may not be a true reflector of what's going on and what people are feeling.
I think what you're saying, David, is that you do need the figures as well as
Yes.
things, and that's the issue, isn't it? How can you have all these statistics covering all these topics available? Or you can't keep switching them on and off. So we think you want them with them. So there's a kind of resourcing issue, there's a kind of continuity issue, and all of that, and that's
But I'd like to just comment on that because, in point of fact, there is nothing immutable about this. Statistics do exist for a purpose. Purposes change, therefore you do need different statistics every so often. It's a moving target. As a commercial statistician working with major companies, they often needed to change some of their targets in order to meet their overall target. So the kind of statistic they needed to develop their business effectively might now be different from what it was 5 years ago. And it is a movable feast. Statistics do not exist out there. They exist for a purpose, which has to be defined and used and be carefully. But I really must bring this to a close because I've promised them we'd be out of here. I just want to make one comment because somebody's brought out that wonderful word productivity, and that's very important. And I'm hoping my colleagues will agree that our next will be a one-day in November, and it will concentrate on productivity and AI. And we propose that actually to kind of do it in 2 sessions rather than sort of the morning mainly on productivity and then that second AI. But underlying theme is AI really going to improve our productivity, or is it going to be another false way of getting figures? Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the day. Thank you all our speakers for their kind contribution. Thank you very much.